It's been more than 2 years since the Abraham Accords were signed on the White House lawn to normalize diplomatic ties among Israel, Bahrain and the UAE. How is it being implemented, and is there a wave of reconciliation in the region? I asked Dania Thafer, the Executive Director at the Gulf International Forum, here on the sidelines of TRT World Forum. I'm Kübra Akkoç, and this is One on One. I'd like to start with the Abraham Accords, signed back in September 2020, triggering the normalization of diplomatic ties among Bahrain, UAE and Israel. It opened new opportunities in the region for cooperation in security and defense. How do you evaluate the implementation of the Abraham Accords?
Evaluate it in what sense? From
the implementation, how do you see it is being implemented?
Well, I will say that the Abraham Accords is part of a broader trend of more regionalized security arrangements. And one component of that is the fact that maybe some of the GCC states don't see the U.S. as a partner that's willing to maintain the security of the region to the degree it once has before. And so different GCC states developed alliances and relationships with different countries across the region. Qatar had a strong alliance with Turkey, for example. And so the UAE had, at the time, tense relations with Turkey, tense relations with Iran. And so they chose to have an alliance with Israel, and Bahrain followed.
Do you think the change in the U.S. administration from Trump administration to Biden administration played a role during the implementation, or what role did it play, if it played a role, regarding
the Abraham Accords?
Yeah, for the Abraham Accords.
Well, the Trump administration was a huge aspect of the Abraham Accords. Actually, his administration really were the ones who kind of pushed forward for normalization between some of the Arab states. And it was one of the major sells of his Middle East foreign policy to his constituents. And so I think that had to do with it. But Biden also welcomes Arab states' normalization with Israel. As you know, Israel is a very, very close ally to Washington. And, sometimes U.S.'s policies, Middle East policies are really catered a lot towards Israel. And it was very important for both the Trump administration and the Biden administration. But the legacy, this is one of the legacies that Trump takes a lot of pride with.
Yeah, exactly. Like that scene that on the White House lawn, that scene that the leaders and representatives shaking hands and signing the accords. Of course, it's one of the milestones in the normalization of among these Middle Eastern states. So I'd like to also ask you about growing Iranian presence and also influence in the region. And also it's being discussed that there might be a possible return to the JCPOA, the nuclear deal. I'd like to hear about your reflections on this, with specifically regards to the security in the region.
Okay, in reference to the Iranian role in the region, from the GCC's perspective, it's one of the major top security issues. The GCC states themselves do have various relationships with Iran. We have, some of them have engaged with Iran to contain Iran, and others have had more antagonistic relations with Iran, namely, especially Saudi Arabia. And Iranians' ambitions in the region are one of the major reasons why there's a lot of tense relations between Iran and some of the GCC states. But not only that, its ballistics missiles program is a great concern among the GCC countries. And I think from the perspective of GCC states, they find that Iran is not willing to compromise on major security issues to them. For example, in Yemen, as the war has continued, Saudi Arabia and Iran had a few rounds of talks in Iraq, in Baghdad, hosted by Qadami, who's no longer in power. And you know, the Saudis, they want to talk about Yemen first. It's a key security concern for Saudi Arabia, whereas the Iranians want to make this the last priority in their discussions. So it just seems like there's no room for negotiation with Iran about these issues.
Yeah. But with regards to the nuclear deal, how do you see, how likely is that Iran is like going back to the deal?
Okay, so the nuclear deal is practically dead from the view from Washington and view from Europe. I think there's not much optimism about going back into the JCPOA. And that has ramifications for the region. I think, like for example, from the perspective of Saudi Arabia, the deal failure is a good thing if there's a U.S. commitment still in the region. But the failure of the JCPOA and a lower commitment from the U.S. puts Saudi Arabia in a very awkward situation when it comes to engaging Iran. And so that goes back to your first question, and that's why we see more regionalized reconciliation, agreements, movement towards stronger relationships. We've seen that Turkey, for example, has established relations with UAE and Saudi Arabia. And all of this is in response to Iran's role in the region, and also the failure of the JCPOA could be considered as part of that.
Part of that wave of reconciliation in the region, right?
Yes.
And I'd like to ask you about the recent summit. It's actually the first China-Arab state summit. Chinese President Xi Jinping met with GCC leaders, and like he said, actually, China and GCC states are natural partners for cooperation. How do you evaluate China-GCC states' relationship?
How do I evaluate? Well, it's definitely has moved into more interdependence in the last few years, and the GCC states have pivoted eastward, certainly. And I think that though there has been an increase in interdependence between China and the GCC states, for example, I still primarily see that as a commercial engagement.
Commercial.
Yeah, and you know, the Chinese have a lot of leverage in the GCC economically, and the GCC have a lot of leverage in China. And there's a lot of demand from China for hydrocarbon resources, and I think that's really important to them. And since the U.S. has kind of moved away from importing a lot of its oil, there's been a lot of domestic importation, China has become more important in that regard, securing revenues for hydrocarbon resources.
How do you see the ongoing conflict in Ukraine is affecting this? For example, as we said, China, GCC states relationship, or the wave of reconciliation in the region, this energy crisis, food crisis, and all the uncertainties. How do you see this conflict is affecting the regional dynamics?
Well, from the perspective of the GCC states,
Yeah.
the Ukraine war actually gave an opportunity of more political maneuverability, and the disruption of hydrocarbon resources from Russia has really caused the prices to go up. And the GCC states also have increased in their political leverage because Europe is desperate to find resources. United States is very concerned about the prices, and so is Europe, and I think other countries as well. And so they gained some political leverage to kind of increase their demands from Washington and European counterparts as well. And so although you see it as a crisis for everyone else because of the inflation of food prices and the cost of gas for example, for the GCC states, has really benefited them.
Lastly, I'd like to ask you about the book you're working on at the moment. And I know it's on creative insecurity and integrating youth in GCC. Tell us more about that. And I would also like to hear about the obstacles for integrating youth.
So this book that I'm writing is about creative insecurity, and how I define creative insecurity is how the institutional environment affects the opportunity for innovation, and how that situation in itself affects national security. Now, the GCC states, as we know, are in some difficult waters when it comes to navigating their future of their economies. We have the climate issue, which is arguing for decreased fossil fuels. They've experienced under COVID terrible prices. We've never seen prices that low, in at least in my lifetime. And so they have to navigate. They have a large youth population. They have to navigate how can they develop those economies. And the problem is there's always these big mega projects in the GCC. I mean, when you hear about the GCC, you see about the stadiums, the hotel, big mega projects, but not enough investments in entrepreneurial sectors, in technologies. And my book actually discusses how elite politics can adversely affect the opportunity for innovation-led development for the youth.
Dania Thafer, thank you very much for making time for being with us here on TRT World.
Thank you for having me.